Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everyone. And thank you so much for tuning in today with us, whether you are joining us live or watching the replay of this session. I am Pauline Vicard, co-founder and executive director of ARENI Global, a research and action institute dedicated to the future of fine wine. And it's my huge pleasure to be your host and guide the discussion today during this Insight series. So Insight series, they are part of our annual research and action program, and they aim to provide a platform for international thought leaders to share ideas and address global issues collectively. Now, education has always been a key theme for us, as indeed the future of fine wine lies in the hand of tomorrow's leaders and their competency and skills. So the topic is extremely vast and means trying to answer big questions like, what does it mean to teach? How do we teach effectively? What's the experience of education? Or what can we collectively do to facilitate access to education? So it's hard enough to answer those questions in a normal year. So add to this 2020 and the online and remote factors, and you've got a very difficult equation to solve. So today is not our first conversation on education, and we already have a lot of resources that you can access freely on our website. So from articles on the future of education that Elaine facilitated, and soon on how to mentor that will be published later this week, to interviews, for example, with Bill and Will Harlan and how they integrate education and skills transmission as part of the 200-year plan. Or again, a bit later this week, a conversation between Eric Asimov, the New York Times critics, and Stephen Satterfield on the language of wine, and where we will ask ourselves if language hinders or help access to education. So if you are not yet a member of ARENI Global, or if you don't receive our newsletter, please visit our website or follow us on social so you can get access to all those resources. Now, before I introduce the great thought leaders and tastemakers that constitute our panel today, I wanted to acknowledge the fact that we are deeply aware of the difficulties that some are experiencing within our ecosystem due to either COVID, geopolitics, natural disasters, and we extend our thoughts to all members of our community that are still very much struggling on a day-to-day basis. We hope that by sharing best practices and focusing on what could work, it might also sparkle some ideas, inspiration and hope. And when it will be the time to act, we will be here to help with action implementation too. But back to today's panel, and I am very pleased to welcome great minds and education leaders, both in this panel, but also in the audience, because I know that many of you listening are leading the way in your own country. We have people from Sweden, from New Zealand, it must be really late for you guys, Australia, the United States, France as well, and of course, the UK. And please add your thoughts to the mix in the chat and your question in the Q&A box, and I will add them to our discussion as we explore what it means to be teaching, learning, growing in today's world. So it is my huge pleasure to welcome 7 incredibly talented individuals, and their talents and achievements are such that I could spend, the 2 hours just presenting them. So here is, by alphabetical order, a small snapshot of their lifetimes of thought leadership, and for full bios, you can also go to our website where we will have more information. Laura, you first in alphabetical order. Laura is many things. Many things indeed. You are the managing director of Catena Zapata, and you and your father have placed Argentina on the fine wine map. And you are leading research, notably on viticulture at the Catena Institute. As a, that's a source that I would recommend to all the MW students that we have in the room today, because it's such a good resource, and you're doing so many interesting research on microbiology and everything. But you're also an advocate for sustainability, both environmental. You've set up the referential, sorry, it's always a word that I struggle with, for Argentina, and social sustainability too. And that's a topic that ties in nicely with today's conversation on developing skills and confidence within your team. You're also a medical doctor, and today you will also consider what we could learn from the process, the methods, the skills and mindsets that a doctor grew up with. Now, we all know that people come to the wine world with a very different background, and Elaine Chicken Brown, your story is unique. Born into a salmon fishing Native American family in Alaska, you first studied philosophy and left your academic career to pursue wine with incredible success, as you are now recognized as one of the leading and most inspiring wine educator and wine writer. You've been instrumental in leading some of the previous conversation we had at ARENI on education. Thank you so much for that. And on framing and articulating answers to very big picture topics. Prepping a session with you, Elaine, is always a treat. And I can also highly recommend all the interviews that you've been conducting for the California Wine Institute. You're doing one straight after with Dan Petrovsky, if you want to tune in after that, to another treat and another very interesting conversation. It's also very hard to sum up Stevie Kim's achievement in less than half a day. A real powerhouse. Stevie, you're the brain and energy behind Vinitaly International Academy, and Wine to Wine that we were just, mentioning offline, and how you need to pivot and reposition that events every day. And you've always placed education, new talents, and digital at the heart of everything that you do. You're on a mission to unveil, explain, and share the diversity of Italian wine, and to educate, communicate, and promote. And you are also placing education in the commercial and business context, which is very, very interesting for the discussion we are going to have today. Jérémy Lamery is not from the wine world, though one might argue that being a fellow Burgundian, you are not a complete stranger to it too. You're also on a mission, this time to prepare the new generation to reach its potential, embrace the future, and make their mark in the world. Both your work and research at the Paris Descartes University, in one of France's leading lab, is focused on cracking the process of learning. You've written this book, you might be able to see, which in French is called Les compétences du XXIe siècle, the 21st century skills, an essential book to understand the skills we'll need to develop to adapt to this changing world. So more on that straight after. James Tidwell, thank you very much for being with us today. You are one of the 269, I think, up-to-date master sommelier in the world, and one of the two minds behind TechSom. Then I am really counting the days to whenever we will be able to travel again, to go to Wine, of course, and to join TechSom, an event that not only placed Texas on the US wine map, but also inspires generations, and in many ways have changed the way we look at the SOM job. James, you are also an AMSAPLU student, and I know that you have key views on the importance of formal education and certification, and how they can, to some extent, make you better at our job. And finally, I am thrilled to introduce Damien Wilson. Damien, I'm just going to pronounce it the French way, because I like, it's easier and I like the sound of it. So Damien Wilson and Valérie Westrelin, they share way more than the first letter of their family names, as they are both shaping the brains of future leaders. Damien within the wine business course of Sonoma State University in California, and Valérie within ESG Luxury Management, one of France's leading écoles de commerce. With great powers come great responsibilities, and we will explore with the two of you what is essential to be taught today, and how education programs have changed and adapt over the years. Wow, quite an introduction. I think you've heard enough of me now. So I'm going straight away. Elaine and Laura have to leave us after an hour. So if you've got a particular question to address to both of them, please go now so we can include them in the conversation. And Elaine, as I was saying earlier, you've been instrumental in shaping all the conversation we had on education. And maybe I can start with you by asking you this key question: what is education for you? And what do you think are the biggest levers of change that our ecosystem has to action?
Yeah, so I think I'd like to respond by kind of stepping back and asking, why are we even having this conversation? And clearly, the big driver for us in asking this panel to get together and talk through education from so many different angles is because we're interested in thinking through how we approach education in a wine and a fine wine context. So if we look at it from that angle, I think we can start to kind of pick apart ways to build the conversation. And in my mind, one of the most important things to note is what we tend to look at when we're talking about wine education. So, you know, Damien does a great job at helping to lead education around marketing and wine marketing. And, but I want to look specifically at how we tend to teach wine and talk about wine. So, in the context of teaching wine knowledge, wine specific knowledge, what we tend to do in wine education, and this is true in almost every program, we tend to talk at the level of content. And we tend to think about like, what are we teaching? We're teaching wine. Okay, well, we need to, so wine education programs in that sense tend to teach technical, you know, basic technical information and a framework for tasting. And the focus in most wine education programs is very much on that level. What do we teach? So again, the main question driving education in this context is, what do we teach? And what I'm pointing out here is that generally speaking right now, wine education is focused at the level of content. But my point is that when we're talking about a robust education program and we're actually invested in the idea of how to teach effectively, keeping our focus only at the level of content is failing to engage with the biggest parts of the of what makes teaching effective. So I think that the way to move forward in wine education, the next steps to really develop and tease out in wine education come from two other levels of question. And those levels are actually what we see ourselves being forced into addressing socially in a broader context in wine right now. So I would articulate two other questions that I think are really important to think about. And one is a little more obvious than the other. And so the kind of second level of thinking about education is simply asking, how do we teach? You know, right now, you know, on a really basic level, we're being forced to go from teaching in person to teaching virtually. So that's one version of how do we teach. But notice I didn't articulate any methods there, right? Really the most important thing to be thinking about at the level of how do we teach is, what are our methods for teaching? You know, are you focused on repetition and memorization? Are you focused on discussion-based learning? Are you focused on, you know, PowerPoint followed by multiple choice? Like, what are the methods that you use to teach? So, you know, I think that question is a little more accessible. People develop their wine education programs. They think about how do I teach to some extent. But what I've tended to see is that there's almost a sense in which this level of question, it's sort of assumed. People take for granted, oh, you teach in a certain way, and then they just do it. And so I think the way to a big important part of moving forward in more effective education in wine is to really intentionally ask, are there other methods that would be more effective for greater learning in wine? But the third level, I think, is where we start to discover the answers to these questions of how could I more effectively teach and what is appropriate to teach, right? So again, how do I more effectively teach? That's a method question. What do I appropriately teach is the content question. But the way to really dig into answering either of those is to actually step back further and, you know, and ask, what does it mean to teach, and what is the context in which I teach? And we're starting to see that we've failed to address this level very effectively in wine. As wine education becomes more and more global, we push into more and more varied cultural contexts, but we continue to pull forward the same content in the same way into these different global contexts. But what I'm suggesting is that the more we pay attention to these questions of what does it mean to teach and what context am I teaching in, the more we begin to question what content we're we're bringing forward and how we teach. And so just as a simple example, I think it connects to what you're wanting to, some of what you're wanting to address today, Pauline. You know, the question of language and language use is something I know several of you have talked about, and how you answer that, you know, what's the appropriate language for wine? How you answer that changes dramatically depending on what context you're in and what you believe knowledge is and what you believe teaching is. And I'm kind of rushing through a lot of kind of quick analysis, but one of the things I want to point out is, you know, if you step back and you ask, you know, what does it mean to teach, and why am I teaching? What context am I teaching to? When you start thinking through that level and then look back to what do I teach, I think what starts to become visible is that in wine we tend to teach how to pull out wine flavors and wine aromas. And we tend to teach basic links to like really basic technical aspects of wine. But if you're asking, why do I teach? Why is this what I need to learn in wine? You know, I think we start to uncover a lot of the frustrations people have both in education and in wine conversations generally. People get into wine because they fall in love with it. People get into wine because it connects them to people. People get into wine because it is delicious, you know, and people get into wine from all over the world, from very different cultural backgrounds, from very different food and beverage experiences, and from very different economic and social backgrounds. And the more we start to pay attention to that level of why am I teaching and what context am I teaching in, the greater sensitivity we can have to the people actually in front of us, recognizing they're here because they want to love this and they want to learn about it. And they're here because they have a background that seeing this excited them to be part of it. How do I link those things together? And so I'm suggesting there are really incredible wine education programs in the world. So I'm in no way slighting those. I'm saying it's time to move them forward. It's time to move them forward and the way to do that is by looking beyond mere content to ask, how do I teach effectively? Why am I teaching? What context am I teaching in?
And what, you know, levers and how it works in our brain and what methodology of learning would, you know, those new skills acquisition require. And that's what Jeremy is going to touch on a bit later. Thank you very much, Elaine, for this very broad context and framing the conversation. And I mean, you've mentioned that people fall in love with wine because, you know, it connects them to other people. Well, medicine in a way is very similar. There's a lot of social and connection and wanting to help people also. So Laura, you've received 2 education, maybe 1 wine education, notably with your dad, but also the medical one, as you are a trained medical doctor from 2 of the best American universities. So what did you learn in terms of process, method, skills, mindset from one world that could maybe more broadly used in the other one, and tying with what Elaine just announced and proposed? How can that help us move the industry forward?
Yeah, thank you, Pauline. So I think that, you know, we're talking about teaching in many different areas. So you've got winemaking, viticulture, sommelier career, service, the business of wine. And I have to say that when I looked at doing rounds in the hospital with our winemaker doing rounds in the winery, it's very, very similar. And it's really based on the ancient art of apprenticeship. You know, in the old days, you know, you learn how to make a shoe, usually from your father or from, you know, somebody in the village that made shoes because that was your family's profession or you decided to go into that profession. And actually, medicine works very much that way. So after medical school, you get the content, you start your rotations, and every morning there's something called rounds. You have to go first, see the patient, get their vital signs. There's a very specific format of presentation. And I think that that's something where wine could learn from medicine, in that you repeat the same format of the physical exam. And so everybody learns how to listen to the different phases. You know when the differential diagnosis is coming, and your brain starts working in a certain way for problem solving. And it ends with what's called the differential diagnosis, which I have applied to my wine world. So when I have a call with anybody at the winery, and I talk to people at all levels of the winery, because I like to be in touch with all the areas, with, with the boss people, with the people in the day-to-day, the more junior people. And I ask for an outline, and then I ask the person to have proposed to me several ideas, and then have chosen their idea and why. And that's actually exactly doing differential diagnosis. The student presents, these are the 5 possibilities for this patient's cough. And I think, it's caused by reflux because of XYZ. And so I actually think that this format of, structured learning, repetition, and, differential diagnosis, which is, the basis of Socratic thinking, that you present options and you choose. If everybody in all professions were to be able to have a mentor that does this with them for 2 years, which is what happens in medicine, and then residency 3 more years, I think it would be wonderful. And the other fantastic thing about medicine is that you do different rotations, so you get different teaching styles. So in business or in the winery, often a junior person starts at a winery and works with the same head winemaker for 10 years. And I don't know if there was some sort of requirement that for your first 3 years, you can't settle and learn the style. I think that's something that wine could learn, any profession could learn from medicine. The second thing are the soft skills. So I think soft skills are equally as important. And this thing that we do in medicine is fantastic at developing soft skills, because first the student gets to see the head doctors, and actually you have a head doctor, a middle head doctor, so you interact with all levels, and you get to see who are the head doctors that you really like and you want to be like. And usually they're the good listeners, the people that are empathetic, or who follow my rule that was taught to me by a Canadian doctor: hard on issues, soft on people. So the people who can give you criticism, but in a soft way on you as a person. And so you actually start learning all these soft skills. And the best medicine teachers, I think, are no different than the best other things teachers, in that they teach the emotional. And 2 things that, one of them I was taught, and one of them I came up with. So the first one, I had a professor who said, listen, the most important thing when you see a patient is to wait for 1 minute before you talk. And a minute is a long time. So you ask the patient, Mr. Catena, what brings you in today? And to actually look at the watch and wait for 60 seconds for them to talk, that creates a relationship where they have the power. And I think that in any profession, if you could apply this, for a sommelier, for a person teaching students, the 1 minute rule of listening is a fantastic discipline. And the one that I came up with, and I think it also applies to almost anything, is what is the most important thing that the patient needs to feel? And I actually think that can apply to, when you're talking, when I'm teaching somebody at the winery or anybody. And my answer to that, the students would answer, oh, that you know a lot, or oh, that you care. But I actually said, no, that you actually love them. And sometimes the students would say, well, how can I love this person? They're actually, shouting, they're being kind of mean, because, in the hospital, you encounter people who get very angry because they waited. And I said, you can always find something about each person that you love, and really think about that. And I think it's also a great exercise, in all paths of life, to think of a person. You could always find something to love about a person, even if there might be something you don't like. And to me, that is part of practicing emotional intelligence. And, when they say that empathy is a muscle, I do believe in that. I think a lot of people have very natural empathy, and that's a wonderful gift if you have it. But if not, you can definitely increase your emotional empathy. So my third point is practice makes permanent, this concept. So this is something in medicine, that there's a lot of practice. And in the other talk, we talked about see one, do one, teach one, which is how we do things in medicine. You see somebody do a procedure, then you do one, and then you're ready to teach one. And usually you see a couple, but sometimes it happens like this. And I think that this practice, repetitive practicing, which I think happens, for example, for sommeliers when they're practicing, they're tasting wines. But the more we can do this with a mentor, it's fantastic. And then my final point is that in medicine, every level of knowledge teaches every level. So you have the most senior doctor who has 50 years experience, that's written dozens of books, teaching the most junior person who does the presentation. And so during the rounds, you have like 5 levels of knowledge all presenting. And I've applied this at our winery because, I don't just want to talk to the head person. First of all, because they don't know everything. And also then it's important that every person feel empowered in what they're doing. And so I think this is something that could transfer to wine, where I think things tend to be very hierarchical. Even in our winery, where I'm always trying to do this, there's still a lot of hierarchical behavior and language. And so I think the more that we can do that, the more interesting it will be for everybody, and the more learning that will happen.
Well, maybe, yeah, thank you so much. A great question to follow up that we've got in the chat is another one that pushed the question away. Sorry. That was a question from Florence Gattiard, so the owner of Smith Lafitte in Bordeaux. How do you interest young people in wine when they are the target of soft and hard drinks with huge budgets? So maybe for you, Laura, how can you make sure that, with all the people you see at the winery, with all the people you train, with all the people you cross paths with, you can, or online as it matters, how do you make sure that you wake up that interest in them?
So I didn't understand like the 2 different questions. One
well,
of them,
I think Florence's questions was, it's when you say you love people and you have to show them love, but then that's when you're on a one-to-one maybe relationship. But then if you take that to a larger context and maybe an online context, and you have to show them love, but soft drinks and hard alcohol show them love with way bigger money than we have.
I got it. Okay. I completely understand. So, I don't always think of money, I should, because if I don't have money, I can't pay salaries, and then nobody's happy. But one thing that is very important to me is having an ethical, rule. So, for example, every time I talk about wine in any context, if I do a tasting, which I've been doing hundreds of them, at some point I talk about wine and health, and what is moderation and what is not. And that is part of my love message. If you really love somebody, you want to give knowledge, but you want to also protect them. And this is one of the biggest struggles when I started in wine, that I wondered, am I going into the right profession? Because I saw a lot of alcoholism and a lot of damages from alcohol. And I came up with my own internal ethical, thinking, which was, as long as I'm always talking about moderation, I think there's so much more good about wine than negative if consumed in moderation. And I'm a big advocate of, if you can't drink in moderation, you should probably actually abstain. If you've tried several times to drink in moderation, you can't, abstention might be your best option. So in terms of the budgets with the spirits, I worry a lot about, marketing to young people. You've seen it more recently with the vaping, and I know a lot of us are very upset about the anti-alcohol lobbying. On the other hand, I think there has to be, for sure, lobbying against, young people celebrating being drunk. So to me, I feel very good about wine, because I feel like I can talk about moderation. The traditional way of consuming wine is in moderation. It has a long history. And I feel sort of morally right, almost like, you know, I'm not very religious, but, you know, the way maybe some religious people might feel about their beliefs. And I think that, you know, I don't envy the spirits, because honestly, I wouldn't want to be in a business that is, you know, making people drink too much. And I think not all spirits do that. Some spirits company are very responsible too. And I know that they have programs related to not marketing to young people. And so I don't know if I answered the question.
Well, I think you did partly, and thank you also so much for bringing moderation into the education conversation, because that is key and that it's central, and that's also very key to the fine wine conversation in general. Like, the only way for us to survive is by, you know, teaching moderation and always be aware that we are dealing with alcohol, and that can lead to all the problems that we know. Thank you so much, Laura. Stay with us a little more, and
Yeah.
I'd like to take a step backwards and bring you in, Jeremy, as you know, the external wine guy and all the research that you do on learning. And today we are talking about knowledge and skills. But reading your book, I actually realized that skills, well, in your book, you talk about compétence, which I think kind of translates in English with competence. I'm not sure it's the exact meaning in English than in French, but we'll translate compétence into skills for today's conversation. What do we mean by skills? How, you know, how did that concept of skills evolved, and what a society based on skills, how does it differ from a previous society that was based on qualification, or again, qualification in French, hopefully translate well in English?
Okay, thank you, Florence. First of all, thank you very much, Eileen and Laura. Before entering the conversation, I wasn't really sure about which angle I was going to take, and I found you very inspiring, so thank you. So when talking about the skills, one of the things to understand is that it's a moving concept. For example, you said that competence might be translated into skill, but actually we don't really know. It could be competency, it could be ability, it could be a lot of things, because actually there are about over 700 definitions of what a skill is, and all of them are correct. So when we are talking about which skills should we have to teach about wine education, or to be to deliver a good service or whatever, what we could say is that a skill is a set of knowledge, abilities, and behaviors. And it's a specific set which is determined to reach a very specific action. And once you move to another action, it's another skill. But basically, that's this like triple that's important: knowledge, abilities, and behaviors. And knowledge is the things that is information, common information that we learn. Abilities will be our, let's say, our capacity to think properly. And behaviors will be the way we interact with people. And actually, in the 20th century, thinking and interacting were not that much important, because we were in a society where everything was processed. With the Industrial Revolution, until the 70s, basically all people had to do was following the rules. That's what people were asked until then. But then IT, information technologies came into the industry, and globally they started disrupting everything, changing the jobs. And before that, jobs were not changing a lot. So you could hire anyone that was able to do the job, anyone that had the qualifications required. But starting from the 70s, with the information technology, interactions started to increase. And the need to adapt to the job also increased, which is why we actually moved from a society where the skills were attached to the job, from a society where the skills were attached to the people. because people started to actually needed to adapt to the different jobs. And what's interesting is that it might seem like a big change in the human history, but it's actually the 20th century that is the exception in human history. Before we live in this processed society, everything we needed to do was adapting on a day-to-day basis. That's the very basis of survival. What humans do is adapt and see threats and opportunities everywhere. To keep it simple, that's all the brain can do. Identify threats and opportunities. And we've been living in this like modern society for, let's say, about 10,000 years. And in 10,000 years, the biggest evolution of the human body is probably our ability to digest milk. It's nothing related to the brain or whatsoever. So everything that's encoded into the brain, the way the brain works, is only related to survival. So we are not meant to work in a tower in the city or in La Défense, and we are not meant to talk about wine. We are not meant to sell it or whatever. That's not what the brain is made for. So from then, it's just social constructs. So once we explored like the brain, neurons and everything, what actually really helps is social psychology, because everything related to performance, it's about like the way we created this notion of performance, being able to reach a result through the given set of skills. And these skills being the proper set of abilities, knowledge, and behaviors. It brings us back here in the years 2000, where actually knowledge becomes obsolete really very fast. And knowledge is common information. From Google, anyone can know anything about wine today or about anything. From Google, you can get all the information you want. And if you can't get them from Google, you can get them from LinkedIn by contacting one of you or something like that. So with the technology we have today, information, knowledge is not the issue. It's becoming a commodity. So if we don't want industries to become commodities and human workforce to become a commodity, we need to focus on their abilities and their behaviors. Abilities is the ability to think. So it's very hard to develop. It's everything related, let's say, to rational intelligence. It's basically when you see people you talk with and you think like, oh, they think very fast, they're smart. Yes, it's part of smart because they have this rational intelligence. And behaviors will most be about, I don't like that much the concept, but it illustrates quite well. It's emotional intelligence. So you have on one side rational intelligence, and the other side emotional intelligence. Rational intelligence for the abilities and emotional intelligence for the behaviors. About rational intelligence, it's basically, let's say, creativity, critical thinking. It's your ability to solve problems. Remember that the only thing the brain can do is distinguish threats from opportunities. And the only way the human can survive is by adapting to its environment. So adapt means that you were able to perceive the signals in your environment. And that's where cognition comes from. Cognition is used to learn, and your learning only comes from your senses. If you don't have any sense, if you're blind, deaf, everything, you actually can't learn because you don't get any information. So you need to get the information, so increase your perception to be able actually to learn. And once you get this information, your cognitive abilities determine what you will do about them, what you will do about this information, how you will process it. And for example, Laura, you were talking about apprenticeship. I can say it.
It's a very hard one in English. I get you there.
So you were talking about like how you can learn with peers and with mentors and everything. And basically what happens in these situations is that these people tell you how to process the information you're taking, how to make the best out of it. And that's actually a useful way to learn, because you can also learn behaviors. You watch people and then you can actually imitate them, understand in which situation they have which behavior. And behavior are more based on personality. and on your ability to show empathy, to understand the emotions of others, and to understand which emotions you should display to make sure that people will react the way you want. All of this, once again, is evolutionary. So in a way, it's sort of, I don't like to say, but manipulative. Mm-hmm. The emotions are, we say in neurosciences that emotions are just a heuristic of optimal reaction. An emotion is just, yeah, okay. What it means, a heuristic is a shortcut. And right. Emotion is just a shortcut programmed into the brain for an optimal reaction. If someone shouts at you, your first reaction will probably to shout at the person or to cry or whatever, but it will be more of a survival mechanism. And actually it's encoded into your brain, the way you react. So you have, your personality is built when you're a child, and then that gives you a lot of behavior, basic behaviors that you will have in the occasions where these stimuli are triggered. Meaning that when you train someone in the wine industry or in any industry, not only you have to teach the right behavior to this person, but you might want to unteach some of them. Because behaviors are linked to empathy, and they are linked to the emotions we show. We can hardly control the emotions. Meaning that if you have in front of you a client that is actually empathic, it will, even if you say something, if you are feeling something else, the client will see it. He will see that you're not sincere. And actually in the 21st century, teaching or learning is more about unlearning than learning. To be able to learn properly, because it's all about abilities and behaviors, you have first to unlearn. I'll stop there, and if you want more,
well, actually, the question to follow up, because it's an important question within the wine world and within an online wine world and a global wine world, is how much culture plays into this. Because how much, you mentioned emotion, you mentioned empathy. Laura said we have to find something that we love into someone. The thing is, with this global wine world, we are in connection with people from a total different culture, and sometimes we are in connection with them through, an online setting, and we can't get all, the stimuli that our senses will give us normally. So how can we evolve into that global and remote world and keep empathizing with people that, I mean, we always share something in common, but sometimes our culture is also very much different.
Yes, but actually you need to see culture like an information, like an input information. For example, when you get to speak with Asian people, you won't get as close as when you speak to Spanish people, because it would look rude. So it's just an input information to actually adapt your behavior and the way you process the situation. Cultural information are available today. You know which stimuli, which input information gives which behaviors.
But my question was more, maybe I should rephrase my question. If we grew up in different culture and through different process of education, does it mean that our brain is going to receive and treat information differently, or are we all the same in treating information regardless of where we come from?
We can see clearly that we are not all the same, because of course we have the information from our culture which says what is acceptable and what is not. But after that, you have your own personality. If you want to be a rebel, if you want to conform to society, if you want to to shine over others, that's personality based, not only culture based. So you have to take into account both, and both of them translate into behaviors and also abilities. Why abilities? Because, for example, when you ask a problem to a French person, or let's say someone from Israel, because it's really it's really clear when you do that. Take someone from Israel and someone from China. You take a problem. The person from Israel will face the problem and answer in a really hard way. In China, you will like turn around the problem and never face it right away. That's cultural, but it's actually linked to ability. It's the way you process information doesn't give the same result in both countries, because it doesn't, the same input information doesn't give the same output information.
So can we conceive wine education as something global, or to be really effective and be really empathetic, as Elaine and Laura mentioned, we have to keep an element of locality into it?
What's sure is that when you want to teach something to someone, whether it's knowledge, ability, or behavior, you have to translate all of them into knowledge. So for example, if you want to teach the right behaviors to sell to Chinese people, you have to be able to process the proper behaviors and teach them as input information to adapt your behavior. You'll tell this person, this when you do this or this, you need to do, you expect people to do that or that. So you need to be able to process information. So what's sure that yes, you can adapt a global wine education as long as you have the right information to understand the specificities of each area. It all, in the end, if you don't want people to be, let's say, obsolete in the way they approach it, you need to conceive knowledge as the basis to develop knowledge, abilities, and behaviors. And from there, you'll be able to actually distinguish the opportunities of when adopting which ability or knowledge or behavior.
Well, thank you so much, Jeremy. Elaine, do you want to maybe react to this and add anything on that? Because, I mean, if I understand this right, then of course we are juggling with very complex concept, but from what you said at the beginning, the next step that we have to do is include more empathy in anything that we do. So if I'm correct in understanding what Jeremy says, we need to transform what it is to be empathical, to show empathy in information that we can teach to people so that they can develop the ability of empathy. Is that correct, Jeremy?
So sort of, you have to start with that. Of course, it's better if the person is naturally like that, but you cannot find like an army of people that are exactly like you want. So you need to teach them the right behaviors.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I'm having to like calm my brain down because I kind of click back into my former training too quickly. So I'm trying to kind of translate what's in my head into something I can say. Okay, so let me step back for a second and try to engage what Jeremy's saying and link it to what I was talking about too. So if we look at what we call wine education, we have very specific programs, right? So in the United States, we have Society of Wine Educators. Globally, we have WSET. And then we also have, you know, two other organizations that, of course, also deliver their own sort of wine education. So the Institute of Masters of Wine and the Court of Master Sommeliers. But at the base of these kinds of programs, what we tend to call wine education is more, it tends to be more specifically classroom-based, very specific sort of information learning. And what I'm trying to point out, that, and what I think Jeremy is getting at too, is that in this kind of context, what we call wine education, we have actually narrowed to a very small range of information, types of information, and very narrow types of teaching. So we tend to call wine education classroom-based learning of information. There are some overt skills that get included with the court. Very importantly, service is an integral part of earning any of their levels of certification. So that's a slight difference that is appropriate to the purpose of the court. So, but again, we tend to assume, okay, this wine region has these key growing conditions, which produce these key wines, which appear in these key ways. And it's like this information chart. And to pass the exam, you have to be able to redeliver these types of information. And so and to earn recognized certifications that then label you with a title that proves you've learned what you're supposed to know in wine, you have to go through classroom-based information, learning of certain types of information. So part of what I'm getting at is that when we step back and ask, what is the purpose of teaching wine at all? We start to see that in as much as what I'm describing is right, like that level of information, that kind of information delivery is profoundly narrow and does not always link very profoundly. It's not always that helpful in most of the context in which we want wine.
And and thank you so much, Elaine, because that's the perfect tie-in. We've talked about a very global concept, and then I'd like to bring Stevie and James in the conversation now for maybe not the practical aspect, but the application of all of those information and everything. Stevie and James, you are organizing, 2, or in the case of Stevie, even 3 or 4 major events in the wine industry, and you've all put a lot of focus on education in it. How do you see the role of those major events like yours? What role do you think they are playing in terms of education? Maybe Stevie, if you want to start, and how you put education into what you do.
First of all, I started this school called Vinitaly International Academy, and it's highly specialized in Italian wine. Now, the reason why I've started is because when I had looked at most of the students, so first of all, let me just give you a brief overview of what it is. It's something between WSET, maybe equivalent in terms of difficulty level, maybe diploma, and it's a 5-day intense program. It's 4 days in class, like you said, Elaine, mostly, because it had to be standardized in some format. And we have students that are coming from all over the world. So we have a flagship in Verona, and then more importantly, in 2 big areas of Italian wine promotion area, which is, America. So I'm talking about North America, mostly stateside, but as well as Canada, and then China, because that is that's the sexiest potential market for Italian wine and every other wine. Because of that, I had to provide a program where it can work for all different layers of culture, and which meant at the selection of criteria had to be pretty high, so that it had to screen the level, because it's also executed in English, which of course is a big problem area for a lot of the other non-native speaking students, as well as the level of basic wine education. So most of them will be diploma students or candidates, as well as some MSs and MWs. So the level is quite high. The pass rate is 25% at first seat. We've gone through about 1,000 students, and now we're up to about 230 quote unquote certified ambassadors, okay? So it's quite tough, but in the beginning, and I go back to a little bit about what Elaine said, and also Laura and Mr. Darwinist Jeremy Lamry, who gave us I started taking all the definitions and I stopped of the glossary of what it is to learn these days, the skills. So what happened was that in the beginning, it was exactly that. We kind of had the idea of focusing on the exams, making it as difficult as possible, because somehow I think the trade, the society, the upper echelon of wine education, meaning, you know, the MSs and the MWs, have dictated that the more difficult it is equals, you know, more prestigious. So we have kind of followed that route in the beginning. We started this program about 2015. And after 3 years of turning out ambassadors, we understood that, because in the beginning, the exam was only 100 multiple choice questions. That was it. Okay. And the tasting element of the exam was only for the expert level. So those who are, you know, become, like, there's an expert level, ambassadorship level. Then I realized after 3 years of doing this, many classes, that it didn't really measure. Like, I call them an ambassador, but if they couldn't even present, you know, the wine and explain to the society what they were saying, or their understanding capacity, it was kind of a failure in a way. So we have completely overhauled the program now to include also the tasting element. And one interesting other aspect is also we make them do group work amongst the students, and they have to present a video presentation. So we can also, we kind of force them to work together and come up with a product. And that also allowed me to understand their capacity to speak in public, which we had never done before. It also allowed them to work in a group from different cultures. And that also gave us a great feedback as to how we can improve the program. Now, I think that because the classroom situation, the wine education equals WSET for the most part, right? Because that's kind of standardized. I'm sitting through a diploma program just because I'm curious as to what it is. And I think there is a need for that, right? Because you have to start somewhere, right? Because you need to have an understanding of what wine is. Like, all of you guys, you know everything about wine, but someone like myself, I had no idea what wine was. I mean, I drank it a lot, you know, but I think that just qualified me as an alcoholic, right? Like, it doesn't mean that I'm an expert by any means. So I think we had to start somewhere, and that's where the classroom is it's a base. But then as an add-on, then after that, what do we do? So we have integrated, you know, like what I call Gita Scholastica, which means basically a field trip. And my, the academy program, it's a little different from, you know, your standard wine educational program, because it's just like a sliver of service, which I offer into the whole spectrum of what Italian wine promotion is, right? So you guys know the exhibition bit of it, but then I incorporated the academy just as so that we can make those connect, the love connect, because you, Elaine, you spoke about falling in love with Italian wine. And I can only do that if I can have the ambassadors come back to Italy as many times as possible, because they have, then, you know, I don't think the French are better. I mean, they make better wines, frankly, right? But they're incredibly, yes, but they're incredibly good at the fact that they have established this long history of having people go to the territory. Because I think if, whenever a student or any of you come to Italy and you fall in love with Italians, the hospitality, the food, the way of living, right? So that's kind of a very important aspect of what I do. So it's not just the wine education, it's just small part of what I do as whole. And I think that's very important to contextualize. in itself, like just a certification or a diploma, it doesn't have a lot of meaning. But if it is, because it also depends on who are we educating. Are they, you know, professional educators? Are they journalists? Or are they trade people? Or are they students? Or are they wine lovers? So I think we need to contextualize, you know, wine education in general. Having said that, I think one thing that is a common thread, I think theme that came out with Elaine and also Laura, who's gone, I believe, and is this thing about, you know, thinking with the, you know, the brain. You spoke about that, Jeremy, but then also about the emotional intelligence. The only way we can do this properly, if we can have the, you know, all the intelligence, you know, with the brain, but also with empathy. And we have to be able to connect these two together to have a sounding base to do any type of, I think, wine education.
And I was smiling as you were talking, because Jeremy in his book, he describes 4 kind of skills, and one is, of course, the technical skills. We're very good at that in the wine world, the behavioral and emotional skills, but also the skills citoyenne, or like the citizen skills, meaning how we learn to develop skills and behavior within a social group. And I really love the part where you were saying that by putting them in groups, by seeing how he evolved, and you know, that's also a type of skills that we don't really talk about in the wine world, how to develop those kinds of, not social skills, but how to behave. Sorry, I've got all the text in French. I'm trying to translate at the same time, but that social group citizen kind of vision. And thank you very much, Stevie. And I think that ties really well with James. And James, so not only you are the organizer of TechSom, which I think quite a common vision with what Stevie is doing at the Vinitaly International Academy.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Can I just add one more thing?
Yeah, of course, sorry.
Jeremy said that about Google University, right? So it's true, like all the wine education you can find on Google. The best, you know, even unis have all of their courses, a lot of them quite free. So why do we send our children to schools, right? Or wine education schools? And I think it has to do with the interpersonal, you know, aspect of it and the network that it provides, because especially like in America, I see my nephews, they're spending so much money on, you know, education in general, and I'm like, why do they need to do that, right? And even I have children at school, they don't need to go to school, to be quite honest. They can find everything online. I mean, I think we are very privileged. However, that interpersonal networking, you know, the skills that they acquire in a class, even a classroom. So the classroom isn't just sitting down and taking notes and, you know, learning, but it's about the interpersonal side to things. And I think that's very important.
So even better tie-in for James now with that question. James is going through all the MS program, and we know how hard this program is, and going through all the MW program, and I know how hard this program is. Is it just for the network? Or does it bring you, or what kind of thing does it bring you to be better at your job?
Well, I think first of all, I'd like to say that I have not gone all the way through the MW program, so I can only speak to that program as a student, and I'm not even sure I'm that right now due to COVID finances, but I do know a little bit about it. You know, one of the things I'd like to tie back to leading into that is learning, which I just Googled because I wanted to see what would pop up first. And the definition of learning is the acquisition of knowledge or skills through experience, study, or being taught. So there are a lot of ways to learn, one of which is formal education, which if you look at the definition of education, one of them is systematic instruction. The other is an enlightening experience, which I think to some extent ties into what Elaine was saying, in that it has to go beyond the basic facts and the technical information. And as to both of the two programs you just mentioned. I've also done SWE and WSET, so I have some experience with those as well. But particularly with the Master Sommelier and Master of Wine programs, because they are not in their essence advertised as education programs. They're certification qualification programs. Certainly the Court of Master Sommeliers at its basic level educates. I think if you go back to what Jeremy said, there needs to be some basic level of knowledge in order to advance off of that into other ways of learning and areas of learning. I think what both of these programs do well is provide a structure for learning. That's not the same thing as classroom education. They both provide, and this is what I feel like a lot of us as students miss about both of these programs. Because of movies and books and articles and all of these things, what do we get caught up in? The rigors of writing Oxbridge essays for hours in the MW exam, or flashcards and tasting wine in 25 minutes in the Master Sommelier exam. And yet that's not really, to me, what either one of those programs really imparts. What those programs impart are a method and a framework for study, but both of them, in both of those programs, you have to be self-motivated. You have to be self-disciplined. You really have to understand going to those exams in the way the exam requires you to come to it, which is about exam technique and understanding what you need to learn. But you also need to really know yourself well enough to understand how you need to approach these exams and the learning mechanism to get to them. The exams themselves are a validation that you have reached a certain level of competence in whatever area they're testing. No exam can test the entire wine world, right? Not any. So what they both provide is a framework for learning to get you to a certain point, but then beyond that, you still have that framework for learning that you can carry into your life. And I think that goes to the point of Stevie's point about a certificate is just a certificate, right? And then you move beyond that into what can I do with this and what have I learned to get that certificate that will carry me further.
Well, that's I'd like to give to take Elaine back in the conversation before she has to go. But next question to you, James. So Jeremy mentioned that we moved from a world of based on qualification to a world moved by skills. And
Right.
you said that both the MW and the MS are qualification program. Shouldn't those programs be reframed, not based on qualifications, but skills? And how, and I'll let you 2 minutes to think about this. And because Elaine, you wanted to react on Google just before you go and you run your own seminar.
Yes, excuse me. I have to actually go do a webinar in a minute. But I mean, I think what James is pointing out is really important, because and it links to to something else that I want to say, but that I think part of this is almost like a marketing point, in that there, as James is pointing out, I think there's a misunderstanding about the reason to get these qualifications and what the qualifications actually are about. And that by the time someone has earned an MW or an MS, they have developed a lot of skills that are necessary perhaps to the qualification, yet are also beyond it. And I take it that's part of what Stevie was getting at too. But I think that when we start to dig into the implications of that, it gets us back to an answer to Stevie's question of why should we even go to school? All the information's online. But expertise is not an accumulation of information. Expertise depends on understanding how to work through and understand information It's expertise reflects an ability to interpret what information is relevant to a specific situation and what information is most important in that situation, to recognize, oh, this other information connects and is relevant, but is not the most important piece. This information leads how I must respond and will guide my decisions. So expertise cannot come from merely accumulating more information. And proper education goes beyond simply teaching information and instead helps educate a person to become a robust, independent thinker who can take information and do things with it, essentially. So, you know, and I think this gets at this point of qualifications show we've achieved certain kinds of things and very different sorts of, it's really importantly, as Stevie was getting at and that James was getting at, you know, the MW, the MS, and the Italy Academy, none of those are merely qualifications of accumulated information. They reflect expertise of a certain type in a certain aspect of wine. But the point, again, is that expertise is beyond mere information accumulation. It is learning to take information and do things with it, which I think gets us back to Jeremy's point that we're talking about skills and also rational knowledge and like all of the things need to come together. And education is never merely teaching, and education is never merely accumulation of facts and repetition of facts. But part of my point is that sometimes in wine contexts, we act as if learning about wine itself is merely about accumulating information. And we need to start pushing into those other levels of who am I teaching to, for what reason am I bothering to teach, what information is actually relevant to this context of wine. We need to start pushing into those higher level questions in order to
and the purpose behind education.
Yeah, exactly.
Mentioned.
For everyone, forgive me. I'm going to have to go in about 5 minutes.
Well,
but
before you go, Elaine, I'd like to say thank you for taking all the pressure off me and answering the question. But you know, thank you in all seriousness, because anybody who's on this this seminar or discussion and has heard Mark DeVere's opening at the Master of Wine seminars in California will immediately recognize what Elaine's talking about, because he talks about the progression, the pyramid, as we learn, and then how that leads to mastery. And the very basic part of it is learning facts, right? But as Elaine said, as you move up in that pyramid, which is really how the Court of Master Sommeliers is structured, and to a large degree how WSET leading into the Master of Wine program is structured, you start moving beyond facts at some point into being able to understand those facts, and then even beyond that. And so I think both of those programs, unfortunately, both the Master of Wine and Master Sommelier programs, have been marketed, whether not necessarily by the organizations themselves, but rather by others, in such a way that it's not always understood that that's the purpose of those programs, that the real marketing of those organically has been about learning facts. That's, to me, not the point of either of those programs. You have to start there, but you have to go beyond that to be, and I'll give an example. I remember this was the second or third time I took the Master Sommelier exam. I went out to California, and mentorship in some form in all of these programs is important. And I went to taste with someone, a Master Sommelier out in California. And another candidate for the exam that year was tasting just prior to me, a different set of wines. So the master sommelier said, would you like to hear his tasting? Certainly. And I sat in on that tasting and I thought, I don't know if this person's going to pass this exam, but this person understands these wines.
Mm.
They don't just check boxes for medium plus acid or body or whatever. They really understand how these wines got to be the way they are. And that then went to understands how to utilize them, and then you're picking up abilities and skills that are beyond, as Elaine said, the technical part that gets you to a certain place. And I think that's so important in understanding some of the programs in wine. Certainly there are those that are more fact-based, but I think with those two, and as to what I do in relation to what Stevie does, TechSom has no formal program. We are the experience-based sort of learning and education. So we actually direct other people or people into those other programs for more formal study.
Thank you so much. And thank you for that quote on understanding the wines, because that really resonates, I think, with a lot of us trying to understand wine, not just by getting facts together. We've got 40 minutes left in this conversation, and let me tell you what's left in the program. I'd like to go to Damien and Valérie on how they teach, and because they are program director, I'd like to understand, how do they actually put a program together? How do they decide on what's important or not to be taught, not only to adults that have already had an education that goes into the NWN or the EMS program, but to really young adults and that haven't worked in their life and need also to acquire all of that. And then I'd like to keep maybe 20 minutes at the end to talk about online, because we've talked so much about what it is to teach, which is linked to traveling to countries, tasting wines, getting mentorship, looking at how people do. How do we do that online? How do we do that when we are behind a screen? And Jeremy, you also talked about all the things that are important to learn, like focus and everything. And how does it work online, and how can our mind learn to adapt to an online environment? But that would be in a second part. I'd like to go to Damien and Valérie now and ask them that question.
Can I just quickly say,
yes.
I have to go, and I'm so grateful to all of you for including me. I'm like in love with all of you, and and so I'm really grateful to get to hear your thoughts. I'm so sorry to miss Valérie and Damien, but thank you very much, Pauline, for including me.
Well, thank you so much for responding to the invitation, Elaine.
Thank
Bye.
you, Nicole. Bye.
Bye.
So,
Thanks.
Damien
Sorry.
and Valérie, how do you decide on what's important to teach? I mean, that's quite a global question, but maybe Damien, you want to go first.
No, I'd actually like to hand over to Valérie, but just one thing beforehand, because I've got an interactive exercise.
Yes.
And, I mean, you've seen this, so I'm just going to go through that. And then basically, being the courteous gentleman that I am, I would love to, I'm going to give Valérie the option to answer the questions first. But let me start by just presenting my interactive exercise. And I was going to say, if any of my students are here in the presentation, shout out. We've got class later today, so you better be there. But the other thing I wanted to point out is they'll be familiar with this process because they get this quite regularly. So you can see here, I've got insights on what's going to, on what we're going to present today. But what I wanted to highlight was was this one here. I've got an exercise for everyone where I need you to open up a browser, and everyone presenting can do this at the same time as well. The more responses we get to this question, the better. Open a browser in another screen, or just open that up in front of the webinar you're watching at the moment, and look at the question as presented to you. Once you put in the code ARENI after opening up a browser for the page Slido, SLIDO. If you type Slido in any search bar of whatever browser you're using, Slido, the web page will come up. You click on that and there will be a code, there will be a field saying event code or join here, depending on what the interface is. And if you type in all in uppercase ARENI, you will get to the first question, which will come up and asking you, what do you think is the most important thing to know in order to have a successful career in wine business? Of course, being an educator, this is an important one for me. And so I'll come back to this after handing over, I'll come back to the answer to this question after handing over the reins to Valerie. Valerie, à vous, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Damien. So thank you, Pauline. It's a real pleasure to be part of this great conversation. My question was, what are the biggest change that you've seen over years in teaching? And I think the most important things for me was speaking about generation, because we speak about skills and many things, but the most important thing is speaking about generation, because today companies, training centers, schools are facing new generation. We can call it Gen Y, millennials, it doesn't matter. Even different countries, they are talking about generation shot, mini generation in UK, digital naive in Japan, or wet generation in Germany. So the most important things, let's say, with generations, it's a generation who respect nothing, who doesn't care, who thinks he knows everything. Generations get involved in everything. But let's imagine that in 1720 before Christ, Hesiod said, "I no longer have any hope for the future of our country if today's youth take command tomorrow, because this youth is unbearable, unrestricted, and simply terrible." So finally, nothing new, nothing changed under the sun. I think we have to take a step back to this new generation and to understand what they are expected. Maybe I think the difference is what we expect and what they are expected. For the first time, we are facing people, I think it was, I don't remember, it was James or Jeremiah, who talked about people coming from different countries. But I have heard that there is more similar things between two people age of 20 from Belgium or Japanese people or whatever, than people from the same country from 20 to 50. Because they are, they have the same culture. They are sharing the same knowledge because they are digital native. They are spending a lot of time behind their computers and sharing things all together. That changed the way of knowledge, that changed the digital native. They are changing the way to knowledge, to hierarchies also, and also to the way of they imagine their jobs tomorrow. This generation are not focused on how, but on what to do. I have taken some notes, so they dream a different world. So what we do have to change is to be flexible, and what is needed is going to school if tomorrow maybe their job doesn't exist right now. We are talking about young generation or young girls or boys, and they are 18, 20, and we are talking about things that maybe in 5 years do not exist anymore. We have to teach them things that maybe in 2 years, in 5 years, it may have changed a lot. So the most important thing is not about talking about knowledge, We are to share knowledge also, but we have to explain how to get the information, how to find out the things they want to know. For example, I've heard a couple of years ago that the big difference between two generations, from people who was born before, if I remember well, it was before 95, sorry. I've heard that my generation, if we want to find something, we are looking for the information in our brains. But new generation, when they want to find out an information, they are looking in their phone. Where is the information? The information is in the phone, in the computers. For the new generation, for our generation, we have to learn and to not stock, I don't know the word, I don't remember the word in English, but to store the information in our brains. So the most important things for this new generation is to find out the way to let them to interest this generation in the different knowledge.
And so what I take as well from what you're saying is, when we went back earlier to say, can education be global against local? What I hear you say is, with that new generation sharing so much in common in terms of mindset and how they access information, then information can be more global now than it used to be before. Damien, is that also your take on your side of the world and in California, and how maybe did your educational program changed over the last, I don't know, 10 or 15 years to better fit both the new generation of learners and the new needs of the industry?
The short answer is yes. I mean, there have been a multitude of changes, which is, not in the least bit surprising, to be honest. I mean, there's everything that's going on in the world at the moment is quite. I think the best thing to say is that it's quite stunning for us all. And I mean, the important thing is that if you're going to be an educator, you have to recognize that your skill isn't teaching. Your skill is your ability to encourage someone to want to learn. And there's a real distinction there that I learned the hard way as I started focusing on teaching and trying to convey knowledge and facts and figures and those sorts of things. And it's often, I think it's analogous to the challenge that we find in the wine sector. The reality is, I mean, people will be interested in learning something when they are sufficiently motivated and they have both the attention and the commitment to be able to put things together. But what we're not really great at is understanding how people receive messages. That's really where often we get it wrong. We look from our own frame of reference. We communicate on ideas and concepts that we know about. But what people receive and what people understand is based on what they start with and how they can add to it. So, I mean, as Jeremy would know in the cognitive sciences, I mean, if you look at some of the work by Kahneman with thinking fast and slow, how people think quickly, immediate, emotive ideas come to the front of mind first. And I think, as Laura was saying earlier, this idea about getting people to wait for a minute, it's great because you get past the emotive reaction and you have the opportunity to think rationally. And that's with Kahneman's thinking slow, thinking logically, thinking in a process. And I think one of the I don't want to go into too much detail here. I know we haven't got a lot of time. We want to make sure that there are opportunities for Q&A. And I know that Valerie's got some other things that she wanted to focus on. So I think we need to recognize that the topic of discussion here was all about fine wine. And certainly as my role as an educator is to help particularly undergrads understand that to get to fine wine, you have to start with any wine. You have to start with wine as a context, as a concept, and realize that people can't just enter to the fine wine category, but that tends to be what motivates them. People have that epiphany, that life-changing experience, which kind of directs their attention to wine. They've got the motivation, but the problem is when you have that motivation, you have that passion, you become so focused on the destination of wine, whatever that may be, and that you limit your exposure or your capacity to think broadly or to put different concepts together. You start looking at a more linear process and thinking it's all about the wine. And so my role as particularly teaching my undergrads, is to kind of get them at that stage where they're learning what the content is. And if you're using it in a construction sense, I mean, you have to learn what you're using before you can actually build something. And then when you can learn how to put things together, but true understanding is learning how you can put things together in different ways based on the same materials that you've got in place. And so that's a logical progression of the learning process. So we learn in general large concepts, and then each of those concepts has variations, extents, I mean, lengths and all those sorts of things. And people learn in a binary sense to begin with, when something either exists or it doesn't, before they learn about the degree to which it exists and how it can be implemented or associated with other things. And that's really kind of the main focus. And I think at that point, I probably need to stop, and I'll come back to my poll question afterwards.
Do you have results, or do you need us? Do you need more people to vote, or where are you on the poll?
I do have some results. In fact, I was going to say, let me put them up now so I can move on from that and then just come back to the Q&A. So if I get to them at this point here and go on to the where are we? This one here. Yep. Okay. Okay, so these are the topics that I was going to go over for the presentation, what we're prepared on. And here is where we are. Okay, so the first question, as you can see there, is what do you think is the most important thing to know in order to have a successful career in wine business? There's the, let me get back to that, successful career in the wine business. And there are basically, yeah, the responses were more along the lines of things like empathy, learning about yourself, listening. What I was really happy about is that I didn't see the question wine. And it's not so much that wine isn't important, but you've got to understand that wine is the subject on which we exchange. But all of the elements to getting to that exchange and all of the components that help us convey important details about that exchange are what's going to help determine whether you are on track or not. I've got a second question here for anyone who's wanting to play the second game, but I'll come back to these responses afterwards. Which of the following elements do you consider the most important for a successful career in wine business? And there are 4 questions there. Your multiple choice, you can come to that in your own time. I'll come back and provide the results too.
Do we need to go and vote on sleep?
Yeah, the same link, and the link I put in the chat menu for those who are there. So I can go over
that.
But,
I voted.
You voted, thank you.
Yeah, okay, so then I can get my brain into the next question.
We've got into that, yeah. Well, I'll stop the sharing at the moment, and I just wanted to go back to a couple of queries that came up during the presentation.
Yes.
I indicated that I was going to respond to the question that Bertie put there. Thank you, Bertie, for putting that question. The concept of personal experience linked with teaching, is that a key to successful transmission? It's definitely one of them. My experience, I mean, I've got 4 degrees in wine business, but the thing is, I often am recognized as someone or thought of, being a professor, as someone who knows about the theory but not the practice. And so I worked in the wine sector for 20 years, from production through to distribution, sales, promotion, and distribution. So I've kind of had my experience from all the way across the spectrum. And it's interesting, I'll explain something about the importance of understanding the distinction between a wholesaler or an agent, or just use examples, and you can just see the kind of blank looks on the face. And then you can talk about, well, when I was working with an agent, we didn't actually own any of the products that were there, and I'd have to take samples out and have to clear it with the owners to make sure that they were correct. Whereas if I was with a wholesaler, we buy in the product, and it would be a different matter because I'd be in full control over that, and explain in a practical example what the implications are of the differences between those two. And when you bring in your professional experiences, you can just see the penny drop. The eyes get brighter, the heads nod, all of those sorts of things. And they're really, they certainly, I'm not saying I'm the world's best teacher, but I I hope that I would be looking at constantly trying to find ways to help my students learn. I think that's really the important element to them to focus on here today. People build from small concepts to get bigger, and we have to find out what they know to begin with to help them add to that body of knowledge and to help them appreciate how they go along that journey.
So that ties in nicely to, how can we find a way to teach, to, adapt to our student and to the need of the industry? Well, Jeremy, back to you. We are in an online world, and we are now, restricted to learn mostly through screens, and not even talking about the tasting and the sensory analysis part of the wine education, just, even global education. So in your book, you discuss 4 main principles that are important for knowledge acquisition, which is attention, or focus, maybe in English, the fact that you need to be focused in order to learn. Immediate feedback, so you need to get immediate feedback on how you learn and how you process. Active engagement, so as Damien illustrated, you need to have that nod and that relationship with the student and really engage with them and not be on a just one street. And consolidation of knowledge. How does that work in an online environment? And neurologically, how long is it going to take to our brains to adapt to this new way of learning, basically through a screen?
First of all, I don't think we need to adapt to this way of learning, because we actually learn in so many ways, and the digital has been in our life for quite a long time now. So I don't think we need to adapt to anything. If anyone is to adapt, it's the teachers, actually, that are more used to teach in a physical way. But I think it's a good thing, because a lot of the teachers I know, they actually deliver information. They do not allow the brain to process the information and to consolidate it. Basically, I think it's you, Valerie, that say that before 95, people used to know things. For example, in France, my parents know all the departments and what we call the préfecture. If you ask anyone today, okay, which department is the 71? You can get an answer in 5 seconds, but just because people will get the information online. My point there is that actually learning with the digital still means the same. It's just that the focus needs to move. Maybe we don't want to teach the same things, and it's been a necessity for the past, let's say, 15 to 20 years, but not a lot of teachers actually changed the way they teach. They still deliver information. So when I hear Damien talking about like how to make people experience things, how to actually create a connection, this is what we are talking about. If you want to teach something online, what you should do is actually give some content before class to actually tell people to read or watch the content. And if you want to do it right, it will be something engaging, maybe funny, maybe disruptive, just like the Slido we just saw. And then the class will not be about delivering information, because when you're in physical class, you can tell your student, hey, I see that you're not listening, please pay attention. But now we can use this time in a different way, because with the digital, we cannot necessarily see people, but what we can do is use this time to actually engage with students and come back to something, I don't remember who talked about it, but to a teaching in a more Socratic way, in the way that we gave information to people, because we know that information is sort of a commodity today. We gave them the information. We leave them with the responsibility to actually get this information, and we use the class as a way to create a debate or a discussion about what the information means. And the test or the thing or anything, if we can talk about like the consolidation phase, shouldn't be about like an exam to take or anything. It should more be about something to build the brain, to actually create a stable connections needs to see the use of what it's doing. Once again, survival, everything, blah, blah, blah. So the brain, to process information and make it something viable in terms of neural connection, the brain needs to understand the potential of this information, either to manage threats or to manage opportunities, which is why no one really cares about math when we're young. And it's later when we like furnish our apartment and we say, oh, that's why Pythagoras is for example, when you move and you want to put like this drawer into the door. But until then, you don't really know. And it's actually not to the learners to adapt. It's to the teachers to actually teach the way they should be teaching since the late 90s.
My mum always told me that Pythagore, I guess you've got the same mathematical theorem, that he was here to teach me how to learn, because I was never going to use that knowledge, but I could use how to learn, and that really ties in well to the conversation that we had today. Stevie, maybe to bring a bit more practical on what Jeremy said. You've always been so good on digital and leading the way on online. Like there's always been an online and a digital connection to everything that you do. Does that mean like how are you going to pivot? We were talking about Wine to Wine, which is, an educational event, an informational event. People learn a lot when they come to your event, either Wine to Wine or the Vinitaly Academy. How are you going to make it work online?
So essentially what Jeremy said is absolutely correct. It is kind of the modus operandi of what we do in general, because I think James knows this as well. When people think that there is a course or an event, they only see the part when you're executing, right? So it's the execution of the event, and that's all people see, right? However, I think it's safe to say 80% of my work and my team's work is actually the before. So all the preparation. And the way we work is all the preparation is very heavily digitally influenced, as you know. And so when COVID struck, it was very easy for us to make that transition into a digital solution. Wine tasting, wine education is a bit tricky because there's the wine tasting element. And when you are geographically dislocated, that makes it even more difficult, because I did a wine competition like yourself, James. It's a small one. I only do 3,000 wines, but usually I had 100 judges coming in from all over the world. So what I did this time is I actually sent the wines, but only European-centric judges. Right, so there was that tasting element, and everything had to be in agile mode. With regards to Vinitaly International Academy, we experimented. We did everything online, the theory part, okay? And now the challenge, my original plan was that then the tasting bit, I would have had the time to bring them to someplace, right? Like Verona, for example, because that was the flagship course. That was supposed to happen now, and because of the second wave, now I will have to reformat that. So do I do a dry tasting? Like, do I send the samples? It's good if for my US company, maybe you put a wine list on wine.com and they get shipped to the students. These are all options that you can do, but it's extremely difficult when you have 10 students from China, 10 students from, Canada, and 30 students from US, et cetera, and 1 student from Singapore, India, and 5 students from Russia. So that is the trickiest part in terms of when there's the tasting element of wine. But otherwise, I think also when I'm doing Wine to Wine now, we're going to be heavily focused on doing all the digital preparation in advance in terms of also, you know, all the video formats, all the educational platforms. We have built an educational platform, and we've been accelerating this so that we can adapt to the situation. And I think it's true what Jeremy has said. I agree completely, is that it's not necessarily the students that have to adapt. They do, however, have to adapt to a certain extent, but it's up to us, the organizers, to create you know, digital, I guess, you know, we kind of have to do the reverse engineering from the get-go and then translate that into a digital format. I think it gives us an opportunity also to revise all the content, and that is really has been fabulous for us personally, because we've had the same material for more or less, you know, let's say the first 3 years. We had rehauled it for the past 2 years, and now it's given us really to fine tune, you know, the excess. If we don't need it, we get rid of it. If it's really needed, then we make improvements. And it's been an open dialogue also with the students, because it's continuous. It's not static. And that has allowed us to improve, I think, the program in general. The other thing is that we have been exploring different ways of communicating, not just to the trade professionals, but also directly to you know, wine lovers or consumers. So we've been dabbling with, of course, you know, TikTok, right? So I know that it's something that we've not done before. I've kind of stayed away from the Snapchat, the TikTok, but since COVID, it's been extremely helpful. And mind you, wine is not very, you know, it doesn't have a fast track on TikTok, because, you know, the way TikTok started was with 12 to 16-year-olds, and wine was not something that they had promoted. So if you have a glass of wine, not necessarily it's promoted well, it doesn't go viral. But I think it gives you an opportunity to become viral immediately, you know, even if you're nobody. And that kind of bridges the gap of, you know, bringing on more wine lovers and the first approaches. Then you kind of do the step approach and, you know, bring them back to, you know, the next level. So we've just written a song. It was kind of a team building thing for the team. You know, on Fridays we do TikToks, and they have now come up with a new song. And I hope you guys will, you know, jump on the trend and, you know, do the challenge.
Thank you. I'll have to, I admit, I don't use TikTok, but that's, again, a very good link to my next questions to James, because online does create maybe another problem. You've talked about the importance of network. You've talked about, you know, learning into and getting into a community, and how it's important for the wine world. Now, having the fact that we're remote, we get a lot of access to people. Like tonight, we've got all those amazing people around the room that it would have been difficult to get in real life. But we can, as a student or young some, we can see people, but they can hardly see us, or they can hardly see the new talents coming up. So what would be your advice, James, for a young sommelier to maybe not continue learning, but to continue to develop his network and his sense of community while, you know, at home not working at the moment?
Yeah, I think that applies to more than just young sommeliers. I mean, I think our entire industry at the moment. You know, if you're at home and you're by yourself, you feel disconnected in so many ways. But we adapt. And I think we've already seen this, whether it's Stevie talking about TikTok, Twitch, all the other more standard forms of social media in the wine world. I think all of those play into it. And then, you know, the old fashioned phone call does pretty well too for staying in touch with people. But even in terms of learning, Stevie is correct in that the wine tastings become harder. And that's a relational aspect of wine too, especially in the study of wine for the various formal study programs is, of course, tasting with someone. So even there, though, people are finding ways to work with the current situation. I'm currently mentoring a couple of people where they taste wines. I don't have the wine, but I listen to them taste on whatever platform and then give them feedback on bigger concepts than just, as Elaine was talking about earlier, pulling out aromas in wine. And so I think we all are finding ways to adapt. Study groups, information sessions, discussion groups like this one. I think all of these add to the network. Is it the same as being in a room together and working on a task physically together? Maybe not. Modeling becomes harder, I think, in terms of mentorship. But in those cases, you can work around that on social media and other programs such as this, whether Zoom or others. And so I think there are possibilities. The other thing is the experiential factor of going on trips and things. And I know that was one of the topics that had been brought up in our previous discussions. But my first wine trip internationally was, I actually left from taking the Master Sommelier exam for the second time to go on my first international wine trip. So I had been in the business for years and had reached the level of taking that exam and never been on an international wine trip. And to your point, Pauline, in our session on mentorship, we now have lots of information coming in from online as well. And so I think it provides different forms of communication and networking, but I see a list of all these people who are attending, and I see a chat box over here, and I see people connecting. It's a different form of connection, but it's still a connection. So I think those are various ways. Get involved with this, the many programs that are out there online to learn and engage. And I don't think that really changes engagement. It changes how we engage a bit. Thanks
so much. Damien, do you have results that you want to share? And how did people, like, going back to one of the quick questions, what are the skills that we'll need to get in order to thrive? What did the people say about the second question?
Yeah, and I just want to follow on from what James was saying as well. I mean, some of the challenges that we're facing in the modern environment with the online teaching and those sorts of things. And I know that there are some practical implications, like Michelle spoke about the samples getting out, and James saying how he's got to listen to it. And I think we're not looking at this the right way. I think this is a great opportunity, because wine is most often purchased by someone or enjoyed by someone who has had to be convinced before they've tasted it. So we forget that you have to give that motivation, and think of those wines that you've shared with someone or you've encouraged someone to sample or to try, because it's not because they've had a taste of it, it's because you've conveyed something to them which has motivated them to go out and do something. And so I think that's one of the great opportunities we have in this situation with the virtual world. We've got to take wine, the tasting, out of the equation and come up with ways to motivate, to invigorate, to connect with people. And so that's one of the reasons why I think we've, with the focus on digital communications, I mean, I would never, how often would we all be able to get together and how much organising would it take for everyone to be in the same room or have them paddle up on stage? I mean, it might happen if we're going to Vin Italy together, or it might happen if we're all visiting Le Chêne Bleu, or, I mean, there could be all sorts of, or we're visiting Paris and going, hey, Jeremy, I want to look outside of your balcony. I mean, these are the sorts of things which may be absolutely fascinating to us, but they're part of the motivation, but we haven't got them at the moment. So we are forced to adapt to something new. So whether it's utilizing software applications like TikTok that we wouldn't normally need to. I actually think this is a wonderful experience for the wine sector, because the wine business in general has kind of avoided the digital side of things whilst they've been able to kind of just push through not having to do it. And now that people are having to adapt to this. So we're learning about how we learn ourselves. What sort of things, what skills do I need to do? What information is important? What software and what programs should I be taking so that I can help be more involved with what's happening? So as an educator, I'm really inspired by what's happening out there. I'm using multimedia in the classroom. I'm doing these, integrated polls in the classroom. I'm literally, as I'm teaching through the semester, I'm changing the way I want to teach. We're originally instructed to do asynchronous teaching, video your lectures, and then just let students follow up, read the support materials. But I'm learning there are certain students who have support materials and they enjoy reading content. They enjoy watching videos. Some of them would prefer to look over the recordings that I have of my presentation so they can skip through to the important stuff and then just brief over the stuff that they don't want. And so when I ask my students how would they prefer to have the classroom, synchronous Zooms where we interact all at once all the time, or asynchronous, or a change thereof, or some other means, there was a surprising amount of interest in having everything that they possibly could that's going to help the interaction. So it's a bit more work for me, but I'll teach lecture-wise at the start of the week, and we'll have those Slido learning goals to see what concepts have been interpreted. Then later in the week, I'll record material for them and say, okay, this didn't come through well. Here are maybe the points that you missed, and let's have a discussion. We'll have a discussion in the second part of the week where it's online. And even those students who notoriously in the classroom, when they're actually with you, when you ask someone to answer something, there's always the same people who put up their hands. When you do things online, everyone's involved and you get a mixture and you get more people interactive. So I think those sorts of things are really, really good news. Now, I know you asked for my materials or wanted to see more about the programs and the like. I've got a slide with that if you want me to put that up, but that's the only other thing I wanted to add. And I know we're running out of time, so I don't want to give, I don't want to stop anyone else.
I mean, I think you touched on very interesting things, and I do agree as well that it's an opportunity to focus the conversation on something else than facts that don't really go through well through screens. But we had conversation with Priyanka French, who's the winemaker at Signorello in California, and she said, well, that's actually fab, because wine is about culture, it's about food, it's about geography, it's about politics. There's so many ways that we can learn about wine without even tasting, and we'll come back to tasting eventually, and we can all keep on tasting at our home, but at least this we also have to talk about all the rest to make it interesting in a remote world. I'd love to see the results of the polls that you've made, Damien. The second question. You muted. Sorry. Yeah.
So I am. Okay. So I was going to say, I've got the, I'm not going to leave those up there. Let's go back to the results. Let's have a look at the results of what the, okay. So we went through that question. Which of the following elements do you consider the most important for a successful career in wine business? Well, the response came up from business knowledge, professional experience, before wine knowledge, and harvest experience. So I was going to say, thankfully, we got some responses on that, and I think that's a good sign of the importance and the focus that everyone here is working on. I think the wine is absolutely essential, but I think we need the foundations to understand how wine fits in with that first. And I think the response from the audience certainly backs that up. So thank you very much for that one. And I was going to say, anyone who wants to contact me is welcome to do so. I'm going to stop sharing and get this off screen. And
I very much like to know what's inside your wine program, because I'll share that in all the debrief, because we've been covering a lot of ground. There's loads of things in the Zoom chat that I will admit I didn't have all the time to read, keeping both conversation at the same time. My brain still focused on one thing, but I will go back to it. And if there are questions that we didn't address, if you want to put some extra questions that we won't answer today, but you want to put them in the Q&A box or the chat box, please do so, because we will come back to it. As I say, education is the key theme for us. So we'll be doing other online roundtables, other panels to discuss that very important thing and a very important theme. What else did I wanted to say? We have a partnership with ESG Luxury Management with Valérie here, because we've been working together for 4 years in trying to bring new talents into the online world. Not the online world, sorry, the wine world. So we'll be doing some inspirational career kind of thing, try to put the light on inspirational people from the wine world in all the months of November. If you want to be part of this, if you want to show students how cool it is to work in the wine industry and how how they should consider this as a career, please come forward, because we can organize this and showcase those discussions with students. Damien, if you want to join in and bring your student from Sonoma State, we can also do that jointly. So that would be for November. December and January, we are going to focus on the fine wine consumer, because we've got our annual study and big research that we are presenting at the Cité du Vin Bordeaux on the 15th of January. So we are going to talk about this through December and through Jan. And then we'll be moving to sustainability with a trio of panel on environmental sustainability, social sustainability, and financial sustainability, because the wine world needs to make money. I'm sure you would agree, Damien. So that's for the program of the upcoming months, and I'm going to end it. So please subscribe to the newsletter, become a member if you are in the capacity to do so. And Nicole, thank you so much for listening to all the great conversation, and over to you for the closing remarks.
Well, this was, I think, a perfect case study of trying to shine not just one light, but multiple lights on a problem in order to showcase the complexity of understanding a problem. And I think making a hologram from having all your different points of view of really understanding the big takeaway that I had, which is that there's the how and what of what we teach, it needs a lot of thought, but the opportunity with the online now becoming such a part of our lives to rethink how wine is taught is really a ripe fruit hanging from the tree. And I definitely came away today thinking that this is an area, unlike many of the other ones that we've addressed in these sessions, where we all need to do a lot more studying and a lot more work of our own. So I was going to suggest maybe a study group or something to follow up on this. I think it's very crucial time to do that, or we'll, it's the second oldest profession in the world, and yet we're all struggling with how to teach it, and our methodologies are really ready for rethink. So thank you very much for that. I think we have some great ideas going here.